Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're cutting straight through the basic history to decode the actual mechanics of the 1930s Great Depression. We're going to unpack the massive global scale, the systemic failures, and extract the real macroeconomic lessons that still dictate our financial systems today. Let's get right into it.
Here's how we're going to break this down. First, the scale of the crisis. 2, causes of the collapse. 3, the global domino effect. 4, the significance of the New Deal. And finally, lessons from the Depression.
All right, part 1, the scale of the crisis.
Before we talk causes, we really need to set the stage and grasp the sheer magnitude of the devastation that followed the seemingly unstoppable boom of the Roaring '20s. 25%. That was the peak unemployment rate in the United States by 1933. Just think about that stark number for a second. Literally 1 in 4 workers was completely out of a job. We aren't just talking about a temporary dip in the labor market here. We are talking about an unprecedented structural failure. It left millions of families impoverished and totally dependent on private charities and local governments whose resources were just rapidly drying up.
And here's a massive reason why the suffering hit so hard: 9,000. That is the number of U.S. banks that had gone completely out of business by 1933. You got to remember, before this crisis, there was no federal deposit insurance. So when those banks closed their doors, they wiped out billions of dollars in unsecured life savings. People who had done everything right, who had saved diligently, they lost absolutely everything in a matter of days during these terrifying bank runs. So the result of all this? A terrifying 30% contraction of the United States gross domestic product between 1929 and 1932. To put that into perspective for you, worldwide GDP fell by an estimated 15%. International trade plummeted by more than half. The engine of the global economy essentially just seized up. Moving from the raw data to the actual mechanics of the crash, we have to ask, how did it get this bad? Well, this observation from economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz really points us to the answer. They noted that from the cyclical peak in August 1929 to the trough in March 1933, the stock of money fell by over a third. The economy was quite literally choking because the very lifeblood of commerce, cash and credit, was just evaporating from the system.
Okay, part 2, causes of the collapse.
So how exactly did an initial stock market crash in October 1929, the infamous Black Tuesday, metastasize into a decade-long depression? Economists generally debate 2 mainstream views on this. On one side, we have the Keynesian view. They argue that the Depression was a demand-driven crisis. The '29 crash triggered a massive loss of confidence. People and businesses panicked, stopped spending, and hoarded their cash, which led to this devastating downward spiral of lower investment and persistent underconsumption. Now, on the other side, we have the monetarist view. They argue that this really could have been an ordinary recession, but severe policy mistakes by the Federal Reserve, specifically failing to act as a lender of last resort and letting the money supply shrink so drastically, turned a standard downturn into a prolonged depression. To bridge these ideas together, economists often look to Irving Fisher's debt deflation theory. And this brilliantly illustrates the cascading domino effect. See, during the 1920s boom, stock market margin requirements were incredibly low. Investors could borrow up to 90% of the money they used to buy stocks. So when the market crashed, brokers called in those loans. First, debtors are forced into distressed selling just to pay back what they owe. Second, as bank loans are paid off or defaulted on, the overall money supply contracts. Third, that massive sell-off causes asset prices to plummet even further. And finally, this completely wipes out business net worths, precipitating massive bankruptcies, layoffs, and a totally paralyzed economy.
Moving right along to part 3, the global domino effect.
Now, this absolutely wasn't just an American tragedy. The severe international impact is obvious across the board between 1929 and 1932. Look at Germany, for example. Industrial production down 41% and unemployment up a staggering 232%. What locked these nations together in this misery was the gold standard. Countries shackled to fixed gold exchange rates couldn't just print money or lower interest rates to stimulate their economies. If they tried, investors would just flee with their gold. In a desperate scramble, nations enacted strict protectionist policies, like the U.S. Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which completely choked off global trade and pretty much guaranteed prolonged slumps worldwide.
But we really need to ground this macroeconomic data in human reality. This complete global freeze forced drastic, real-world changes. Families across all these nations were plunged into severe economic deprivation. This wasn't abstract. Mothers entered the labor force in desperate bids to supplement lost income, completely altering generational dynamics. Whole households had to totally reorganize just to ensure there was food on the table. The trauma of this daily survival fundamentally changed the psychology of an entire generation.
Which brings us to part 4, significance of the New Deal.
Faced with absolute societal collapse, governments simply had to act. In the U.S., this took the form of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, a really aggressive pivot focused on relief, recovery, and reform. It fundamentally shifted the relationship between the government, the economy, and the citizen. FDR's very first move in 1933 was the Emergency Banking Act, which, along with creating the FDIC, guaranteed bank deposits and instantly halted those panicked bank runs. He created the SEC to regulate Wall Street. Agencies like the WPA and CCC directly hired millions for public works, entirely bypassing the frozen private sector. And crucially, the Social Security Act introduced pensions and unemployment benefits, which cemented the government's role in providing a permanent social safety net.
Now, what's really interesting when you look at the actual trajectory of recovery is this steady downward trend. You see unemployment dropping from its peak of over 25% in 1933 down to about 14% in 1937. The New Deal policies undoubtedly improved conditions and reversed that deflationary spiral. However, it is vital to point out that true full employment wasn't actually reached until the massive, unprecedented deficit spending required to mobilize for World War II began in 1941.
And because of that exact timeline, economists to this day still debate the ultimate effectiveness of the New Deal. It's a fascinating balance. Many argue that Roosevelt's policies successfully ended the panic, managed public expectations, and restored faith in democratic capitalism right when it was on the brink. Conversely, some revisionist economists argue that while the relief was absolutely necessary, the heavy-handed regulations, price fixing, and labor market interventions actually restricted natural business competition, which they argue prolonged the underlying depression. Both of these perspectives are still actively studied today.
All right, part 5, lessons from the Depression. This is the absolute core of it. The tragedy of the 1930s forced a total rewrite of the rulebook for modern macroeconomics. We can distill those massive, complex historical learnings into a few critical rules that govern us today. First, policymakers learned the grave danger of rigid exchange rates like the gold standard, which crippled emergency responses. Second, deposit insurance is simply non-negotiable if you want to prevent psychological panics and bank runs. Third, and perhaps most crucially, central banks now know they cannot sit idly by. They absolutely must act aggressively as lenders of last resort to expand the money supply during liquidity crises. And finally, when the private sector freezes up, the government has to step in with counter-cyclical fiscal spending to stimulate demand.
The legacy of these lessons is very actively alive today. Take this incredibly powerful acknowledgement from former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke. He was speaking directly to Milton Friedman regarding the Fed's failures in the 1930s. And he said, "Regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again." Modern policymakers study the 1930s specifically so they can deploy aggressive monetary easing and stimulus the second a financial panic rears its head, just like they did during the 2008 Great Recession.
But all of this leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to consider. Our global markets today are vastly more synchronized and infinitely more complex than they were in 1929. Financial contagion can cross the globe in milliseconds, not months. Now, we've built an incredible array of economic safety nets based directly on the painful lessons of the Great Depression. But as our world rapidly evolves, we have to ask ourselves, are these systems truly resilient enough to prevent history from repeating itself? It is a question every single economist and policymaker must continuously ask. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.